I need to say before I say anything else to you today in my sermon that I do not speak to you this morning in despair, though at some times it may seem so. I speak to you with some fear, yes, with a lot of righteous anger, yes, with knots in my stomach and with desperate desire for what comes next, yes. Yet I come to you this morning not in despair, but with resolute hope. This week, we witnessed an insurrection, a coup, a violent, though thankfully ill-planned, siege on our nation's Capitol building, the first since the British attacked and burned the White House and the Capitol during the War of 1812. I imagine that you, like me, have felt many feelings throughout this week. There are so many pieces to this, it's hard to parse. But our work here together is to speak truths, to honor what is real and present in our lives, and to affirm for each other a way forward consistent with our values, and so parse we will. First, we must contend with the fact that the sitting president of the United States incited, encouraged, demanded this attack. Over 4 years ago, I remember preaching to my then congregation after the election of the current president. For months throughout the campaigning, I had been clear that although by law I could not as a minister speak to the candidates themselves, I could speak to the various issues at hand, and that many of those issues were not political, they were moral, they were foundational. For all the differences in Republicans and Democrats and any other party for that matter, traditionally, we knew that we shared a commitment to democracy, to this nation's historic and peaceful transfers of power begun when John Adams stepped aside in 1801 after losing to Thomas Jefferson. But 5 years ago, through long and painful months of election coverage, it became clear that any notion of truth, of decency, of tradition, or democracy was at grave risk depending on how this nation voted. There was nothing surprising about what happened on Wednesday. Not really. There was nothing that many didn't predict, nothing that we could not have seen coming, given the cult of personality that exists around the current president, and given his penchant for inciting anger, violence, and self-righteousness based on lies. Just yesterday, I was reminded of a quote from Hannah Arendt, who wrote, "It would be a still more serious mistake to forget that the totalitarian regimes, so long as they are in power, and the totalitarian leaders, so long as they are alive, command and rest upon mass support up to the end. Nor can their popularity be attributed to the victory of masterful and lying propaganda over ignorance and stupidity. For propaganda of totalitarian movements which precede and accompany totalitarian regimes is invariably as frank as it is mendacious. And would-be totalitarian rulers usually start their careers by boasting of their past crimes and carefully outlining their future ones." From day one, anyone listening knew what might be possible because we were being told by the complicit parties themselves. And yet, though I wasn't surprised, I was sad that indeed it had come to this. And I found myself scared at how easily a demagogue with pretensions to power had ascended. And I was so grateful, really, that the incompetence of both leader and followers meant that the military wasn't on board, that there was no organization at work that allowed for more damage to be done. And I am left with a deep and enraged frustration that even now, we allow the current president to continue in that role. We must also face that those who stormed the Capitol were funded, supported, encouraged by institutional Republicans, by lawmakers who were in that very building, by police officers and other law enforcement agencies, and that among those officers and agents of the law were people who, it seems at the moment, not only didn't put up much resistance to these insurrectionists, but actually facilitated their entry into the hallowed walls of government. What does it mean when the core of one of our two major parties has turned its back on peaceful transfers of power, has thrown out fact and evidence, and has embraced conspiracy and violence? What does it mean when so many in our government place personal position and power above country and democracy? I suspect the election of such people is the result of a culture that privileges the individual over the collective. I suspect they are simply a reflection of the cultural trends we have too long ignored, trends toward greed and power. Over the weeks that come, we will find ourselves again and again forced to reckon with the truth of who was involved and why. Already we know that in addition to elected leaders, party leaders, law enforcement personnel, there were among those who besieged our nation's seat of government, those who claim to be spiritual leaders. I'm sure you saw pictures of the self-proclaimed shaman in the fur and horns, co-opting Norse imagery and pretending to spiritual leadership. As you might imagine, I have many thoughts about this particular player in last week's events. Among those thoughts, that spiritual leadership is not something one can declare for oneself. It is earned in the context of community. And even then, true spiritual leadership seeks truth, reality, connection, depth, and not conspiracy. The practical philosopher, researcher, and writer Jules Evans wrote this in a recent piece delving into the identity of that conspiracy shaman. Evans wrote, "The conspiracy problem arises out of deeper problems: mental illness, trauma, loneliness, bad education, and weak critical thinking skills, toxic cultures in both Christianity and New Age spirituality, social media algorithms, and a breakdown of agreed meanings and truths in Western and global society." Evans has written before on what he terms conspirituality, the intersection of spirituality and conspiracy theory. We have a serious problem in this country, aided by the internet, egged on by charismatic narcissists, and we have to find a way to reach those who get sucked in by this distorted version of spirituality, those who get sucked in by conspiracy theories, and those who manipulate the mentally, emotionally, or spiritually vulnerable for their own gain. We are in some senses dealing with a cult of vast proportions, one that, like other cults, eschews facts, blindly follows a beloved leader who calls them special and avers a love for them, all while willing to sacrifice them. And this is a cult like others that will regroup after its initial failure. We have work to do in renewing our commitment to education, to regulating online spaces, and to filling what emptiness or anger exists in people's lives that they turn to this kind of propaganda and lie as if it can make them whole. We have so much work to do against the disaffection that leads people to believe that sharing in this supposedly secret knowledge makes them important or better or special. I felt such sorrow and such anger this week watching the leaders of this glorified cult, both the elected ones and the self-declared ones. And I am left with a weariness when I consider all the work that it will take to undo years of disinformation designed to harm. We must also face the unsurprising, but always deeply disturbing truth that behind the veil of proclaimed patriotism is thinly veiled, if veiled at all, racism. Around the grounds of the Capitol, a gallows was built from which a noose hung. Other insurrectionists carried nooses. And this is no neutral symbol in this country. It's a symbol of racism, of violence, of centuries of trauma visited on Black and brown bodies. No one can have failed to see, too, that the flags that were flown in the name of patriotism were flags with the name of a would-be despot and the flag of the failed insurrectionist pro-slavery would-be nation of the Confederacy. Racism and white supremacy were on full display this week. Anyone who watched the news this week also cannot have escaped the comparison between the security that was put in place for our Congress this past Wednesday and the security that was put in place for the Black Lives Matter protests this summer. Wednesday, There was a smattering of Capitol Police officers, some of whom were taking selfies with the insurrectionists. For the Black Lives Matter protests, peaceful protests, there were ranks of military and police in full riot gear. Anyone with eyes and a thinking mind cannot escape the truth that during Black Lives Matter protests, the purpose of which was and is to gain the smallest semblance of equality and justice in this country that for centuries has been categorically denied in law and in deed, to the value of Black and brown lives, at those protests, hundreds were arrested. And here, during protests designed to halt and reverse our established fair and free democratic processes, just around a dozen folks were arrested. Images abound of these white supremacist rioting seditionists being aided by police, escorted off the grounds and let go in spite of having been armed with explosives and zip ties and weapons. If you needed any more proof that racism is among the founding sins of this country and that we have so much healing and atonement to do, there it is. Right there in full Instagram color for all the world to see. Our racism is baked in, and the images of this week of white power bullshit left me so angry. So angry. I can't even begin to imagine the harm those images must have done to our Black and brown American siblings who have always and still know deeply every day the horrors of American racism. And I am left with so much righteous fury for all of us, because as I have said over and over, and I will say until my breath is gone, our racist system impoverishes all of our souls. And until we can make real change, we are all complicit. We also have to face that right alongside those racist signs and symbols were the signs and symbols of neo-Nazi anti-Semitism. A sweatshirt with the words Camp Auschwitz. Another shirt with the numbers and letters 6MNE. I had never seen this. It means 6 million was not enough. That left me speechless. My family fled Russia during the pogroms of the early 20th century, finding safety here in this country and escaping the unimaginable horror of the genocide of World War II. But they say that trauma lives in our DNA, that those of us whose people have had to flee, whose people have suffered attempted extermination or centuries of trauma, that we carry those memories programmed into our very beings. That we live and love and trust and believe in ways that are impacted by those bone deep truths. The folks who stormed the Capitol displayed brazen and blatant symbols of anti-Semitism that tear right at the wounds of Jewish people around the world. This reminder that perpetual evil lives waiting. That reminder invokes a deep fear, if also a deep resolve, forged through trauma and grief. That passage from Hannah Arendt continues. The Nazis were convinced that evil doing in our time has a morbid force of attraction. The attraction of evil and crime for the mob mentality is nothing new. And again, there's no surprise. Certainly most Jews, most medievalists like me, and most general students of history would tell you that anti-Semitism has lived and thrived for millennia, in large part buoyed by distortions of Christianity that proclaim Jews at best the ignorant uninitiated, and at worst the enemy that killed their savior. The end of World War II didn't end anti-Semitism, and it was right there in all our faces this past Wednesday. I felt, again, sorrow at the unbelievable way that evil is entrenched. Fear at the breath of hatred on display. And still, I am left with resolute hope. Honestly, this list of horrors we must face as a nation probably barely scratches the surface. I've almost certainly forgotten some aspect. But even with this, we are left with some hard truths. Too many in this nation are at great risk of manipulation and indoctrination into cult-like conspiracy theories masquerading as knowledge and spirituality. Racism, anti-Semitism, and so many other hatreds and oppressions are alive and well, and we are doing too little, too late to counter them in a meaningful way. All our notions that America and American democracy are special, different, invulnerable, better than those shithole countries over there, that has all been proven wrong, though thankfully without an actual dismantling of democracy just yet. And if we don't make drastic changes soon, we will find ourselves over and over in this same situation, only the threat will become more organized, more prepared, more visionary, and more successful. Olas and I spoke late this week. As we talked about all that had happened, Olas pointed out that we as a nation have somehow forgotten that vigilance against tyranny is among the most necessary acts of democracy. When I was young, I found Thomas Jefferson fascinating. I read biographies about him in middle school. For all his many, many flaws, he could turn a phrase. And the ideals he held when they were applied to all people of any gender or race, they are truly ideals to live by. Around the top of the Jefferson Memorial in Washington, D.C. is the inscription, "I have sworn upon the altar of God eternal hostility against every form of tyranny over the mind of man." Too many among us have become confused about what tyranny is and about what truth is. And this is where it all gets so damn complicated. Those who stormed the Capitol with their racism and bigotry and violence, many of them believe they are the righteous ones, the ones saving democracy. I know it's hard to fathom, but they believe the threat of tyranny is the left and its evil doing. They don't believe themselves to be caught in the throes of a charismatic tyrant. And for me, that is where despair starts to creep in. How do we deprogram millions of Americans? How do we deprogram their prejudices, free them from the manipulative tyranny of lies, teach them to think critically, fill their lives with something else so that evil doesn't step into the vacuum of dissatisfaction and a lack of purpose? The despair creeps in because my privileged white self wants an answer, wants to be able to control what happens next, wants to be able to fix all of it. It's what I'm used to. And despair creeps in because I know that I can't. But just because I cannot make all of it whole, that doesn't mean I am without power. I can tell stories, recount the truths of history that teach us to fear tyranny and work vigilantly against it. I can do that human work of aiding our collective memory so that we do not repeat the tragedies of the past. I can advocate for new curricula, read books, support films that speak the real stories of Black and brown bodies, that speak the real stories of the indigenous people of this country, that tell the truth, no matter how hard it is to hear. I can be part of movements for change, movements against racism and anti-Semitism, movements to reunite families and to open our borders, movements to secure democracy and a vote for all that isn't infringed on by gerrymandering and vote suppression. I can use my time and my voice and my money to support protests that work toward the American dream as I believe it can be. I can be part of a much needed culture change that will have political ramifications. I can demand in my life and with my vote that we begin again to understand deeply community, our interdependence, our commitment to each other. Auden wrote back in 1939, "We must love one another or die." How true this still is. I can raise my voice to proclaim loudly my deeply held belief in our shared humanity and in the power of love to restore wholeness for all of us. I can hold tightly to hope, not naive, but active hope, that proclaims that for all its failures and false starts and deep wounds and soul-wrenching sins, America has some good bones. If we can strip back to the ideals hidden and obscured by centuries of wrongful interpretation, we can build something beautiful. I can work hard to remember that, because in remembering that, I will find the strength to keep working for change. And I can use every moment, every opportunity I have to, in Auden's words again, show an affirming flame. Because in amongst all of this, in all the horror and the pain, in the anger and frustration and fear, aides remembered to bring out the boxes that contained our ballots. Congresspeople went back to the site of trauma and did what needed to be done. Folks got on their hands and knees and cleaned those hallowed walls. Auden wrote on the eve of World War II, "Defenseless under the night, our world in stupor lies, yet dotted everywhere. Ironic points of light flash out wherever the just exchange their messages. May I, composed like them of eros and of dust, beleaguered by the same negation and despair, show an affirming flame. Ever and always, I can find in memory and in history, in my heart and in my beliefs, a wellspring of strength to keep on working for what is right, taking care of my house, my communities, taking care of this world we share."